Thank you for joining me today to hear about Frank the Poet, also known as Francis MacNamara, who was an educated, highly rebellious Irish convict transported to Australia in 1832, who defied a brutal prison system by using satirical verse to mock his oppressors and advocate for fellow prisoners. His 1839 magnum opus, A Convict's Tour to Hell, is a sharp Dante-inspired epic poem that serves as an act of literary vengeance against the corrupt colonial regime. In the poem, the narrator dreams he dies and travels to hell, only to find it populated entirely by sadistic prison floggers, magistrates and tyrants, enduring the same horrific tortures they once inflicted on convicts. Deemed too good for hell, Frank is sent to heaven, where St. Peter and a welcoming committee gladly grant him entry, effectively overturning the systemic injustices of the Australian penal colony. Each episode of Essays from a Strange Country looks at who Australians are through the lens of what our culture has produced, such as an Australian film, literature, art, and music, to ask how this country has imagined itself. This is not a search for one neat national identity. Mercifully, no such thing exists. Instead, we'll read through the mess, the stories, images, songs, and screen myths that make Australia feel familiar, strange, beautiful, brutal, and faintly ridiculous. And I'm your host, Jasmine Wolfe.
You prisoners all of New South Wales, who frequent watchhouses and jails, a story to you I will tell, 'tis of a convict's tour to hell, whose valour had for years been tried on the highway before he died.
The British penal colonies were not merely dumping grounds for surplus offenders, though they were certainly that too, in the grand imperial tradition of mistaking distance for policy. They were systems of total discipline, bureaucratic, physical, theatrical, and moral. Their purpose was not simply to punish convicts, but to remake them into something administratively convenient. A convict was meant to become a unit of punishment before he remained a person. The ideal subject of transportation was not repentant so much as usable, silent, legible, obedient, and available for labour. In other words, the penal colony aimed to produce the perfect colonial worker, provided one was willing to overlook the chains, floggings, exile, hunger, and general atmosphere of state-sponsored misery. Frank MacNamara, better known as Frank the Poet, was a poor fit for this design from the beginning. Convicted in January 1832 for stealing cloth, he should have entered the machinery of the law as another replaceable criminal body. The court expected shame, or at least the appropriate performance of it. Instead, MacNamara gave them theatre. He reportedly entertained the courtroom with an improvised, witty, and concise poem about his coming voyage to Botany Bay, turning the moment of legal degradation into a performance of wit. It was a small act, but not a trivial one. The court had staged his humiliation. He revised the script. The authorities wanted him reduced to evidence. He insisted on becoming commentary. That gesture reveals the central tension in MacNamara's colonial life. The penal system depended not only on physical control but on interpretive control. It claimed the right to define what a convict was: idle, criminal, degraded, morally failed, in need of correction. Its punishments were accompanied by a language of improvement, discipline, and utility, as if a flogging were a kind of rough vocational training. Lovely stuff. But MacNamara's verbal quickness made him resistant to this conversion. He was not merely disobedient. Plenty of convicts were disobedient. He was articulate in ways the system found especially irritating, because articulation interfered with the state's preferred fiction that punishment spoke for itself. His first response to transportation appears almost absurdly optimistic. Botany Bay could be imagined from the dockside or the courtroom as a place of rough liberty, colonial possibility, or at least comic escape from English misery. MacNamara's early wit drew on that fantasy, treating transportation less as annihilation than as a strange opening. The optimism did not last long because the colonies were efficient teachers. Across his penal career, he received 14 floggings and roughly 650 lashes. The body kept the score, as bodies usually do when institutions are composing the lesson. These punishments were not incidental excesses. They were part of the grammar of colonial discipline. Pain was meant to translate authority into flesh. Yet the flogging triangle did not produce the silence it was built to produce. If anything, it supplied MacNamara with material. The state could mark his back, but it could not make those marks mean only what the state wanted them to mean. In the official imagination, lashes confirmed guilt and justified further discipline. In MacNamara's later poetic imagination, they became evidence of tyranny, hypocrisy, and the moral stupidity of a ruling class very pleased with itself. Punishment was intended to isolate him inside shame. Instead, it helped furnish a language of defiance. The irony is fairly blunt, so naturally it escaped the authorities. The system tried to manufacture submission through ritual humiliation, compulsory labor, and exemplary violence. But its own brutality generated the conditions for MacNamara's oppositional voice. The convict poet did not emerge despite the penal regime in any simple sense. He emerged through combat with it. The colony supplied the wounds, the absurdities, the villains, the audiences, and the institutional pomposity that satire requires. MacNamara's career begins then with a failed act of reduction. The state attempted to turn a man into a punished object. What it got instead was an inconveniently articulate subject, one who understood that if power writes itself on the body may yet answer back.
Stranger, art thou a friend or foe? Your business here I fain would know. Quoth the poet for heaven, I'm not fitted, and here I hope to be admitted. Pius rejoined, vain are your hopes. This place was made for priests and popes. 'Tis a world of our own invention. But friend, I've not the least intention to admit such a foolish elf, who scarce knows how to bless himself.
MacNamara was one of the bodies on which this system wrote its authority. His punishment record was not a minor administrative footnote, but a colonial text in its own right. Absconding, flogging, return, refusal, more punishment. The rhythm is familiar enough. The system punished him because he resisted, and he resisted because the system punished him. Everyone involved then pretended to be surprised by the result. By the late 1830s, he had endured repeated corporal punishment, including the accumulated brutality of 14 floggings and hundreds of lashes. The intention was clear. His body was to be made into evidence of power. Scar tissue would do what moral persuasion could not. Yet MacNamara's response was not the docility the penal machine had ordered. He absconded repeatedly. More strikingly, in late 1839, he refused to work underground in the Newcastle coal mines. That refusal was not merely a workplace complaint, though it was certainly that too. It was a direct rejection of the system's demand that the convict become pure utility, a labouring object, extractable, replaceable, and ideally mute. Coal mining sharpened the point. The state sent men below ground as if even the landscape might assist in their reduction. Down there, punishment and labour fused almost too neatly. The convict disappeared into the earth and returned, if he returned, as exhausted output. MacNamara would not perform that disappearance on command. His refusal was therefore a kind of anti-labour, though not in the lazy sense beloved by officials whenever a poor man declined to die efficiently. It was a claim that labor under coercion did not automatically possess moral legitimacy. The system defined work as correction. MacNamara's refusal exposed it as domination with a pickaxe. Crucially, he did not leave the refusal as a mere disciplinary incident. He turned it into language. In verses such as "For the Company Underground," and in poetic petitions demanding better treatment, he converted resistance into literary action. This is where his importance becomes sharper than the usual tale of the rebellious convict with a taste for trouble. MacNamara understood, or at least practiced with unnerving instinct, the politics of articulation. The penal authorities could force labor, record offences, impose punishment, and classify men as idle, insolent, disorderly, or incorrigible. They had forms for everything, the surest sign of a civilization in moral decline. But MacNamara answered classification with composition. His literacy allowed him to reclaim his labor symbolically even when he could not reclaim it materially. The state could command the body, but it could not fully determine the meaning of the body's refusal. By writing and reciting his opposition, MacNamara made the coerced worker into a speaking subject again. He gave shape to grievances that the official system preferred to treat as misconduct. A complaint about brutal labor conditions became, in his hands, not whining from an ungrateful felon, but testimony. Not always polite testimony, granted. Politeness would have rather spoiled the evidence. The colonial state understood punishment as a kind of authorship. It wrote on bodies through flogging, on time through sentences, on identity through records, and on reputation through the language of criminality. Every punishment produced a document. Every document pretended to be neutral. The file, that sacred object of administrative fantasy, made violence look tidy. MacNamara contested this paperwork empire by producing a counter-archive. Oral, unruly, portable, and irritatingly hard to stamp out. That counter-archive did not depend on official permission. It lived in performance, memory, repetition, and communal recognition. A written petition could be ignored. A manuscript could be seized. But a song or poem carried in the head was harder to confiscate without removing the head, which even the colonial state generally preferred to reserve for special occasions. Through verse, MacNamara altered the terms of punishment. The authorities tried to make him an example of discipline. He made himself an example of defiance. His refusal of underground labor therefore sits at the center of his larger resistance. It was physical, verbal, and political at once. The penal regime sought to turn men into useful bodies. MacNamara replied by making his body's disobedience speak. In doing so, he exposed the contradiction at the heart of the system. A colony that needed convict labor while despising the convict, that demanded productivity while denying personhood, that called brutality order and then wondered why its victims developed a low opinion of authority. His poetry did not abolish the treadmill, the lash, or the mine. It did something more dangerous to them. It made them legible.
When the devil came, pray, what you will. Alas, cried the poet, I've come to dwell with you and share your fate in hell. Says Satan, such can't be, I'm sure, for I detest and hate the poor, and none shall in my kingdom stand, except the grandees of the land. But Frank, I think you're going astray, for convicts never come this way, but soar to heaven in droves and legions.
For convicts in the Australian penal colonies, justice was less a principle than a decorative facade tacked onto coercion. It existed certainly in the same way a stage backdrop exists, visible, official-looking, and not meant to bear much weight. The respectable channels of complaint were mostly ornamental. A convict could petition, plead, explain, protest, and occasionally even tell the truth, but the system had already decided what truth was allowed to sound like. In the administrative imagination, convicts were not people wronged by particular abuses. They were problems requiring management. If they suffered, that suffering usually proved the discipline was working. MacNamara understood this machinery with grim precision. Colonial authority did not merely punish bodies, it monopolized meaning. The state named the convict before the convict could name himself: idle, refractory, insolent, incorrigible. These were not neutral descriptions. They were little bureaucratic spells, converting resistance into moral defect and brutality into necessary correction. Once a man had been officially described as incorrigible, almost anything done to him could be made to look like administration. Flogging became discipline. Exhaustion became laziness. Refusal became proof of depravity. The file was tidy, which is apparently what civilization looks like when it has run out of shame. Against this arrangement, MacNamara's A Convict's Tour to Hell, written in October 1839, stages a kind of appeal impossible within colonial institutions. If earthly justice had been captured by magistrates, governors, commandants, and clerks with clean hands and dirty consciences, then MacNamara simply moved the trial elsewhere. Hell, in his poem, becomes the higher court. Not exactly subtle, but then subtlety is wasted on a regime that communicates through lashes. The poem is a comic, visionary demolition job. MacNamara imagines a journey into the afterlife where the moral order suppressed in the colony is restored with cheerful savagery. Brutal administrators, including figures such as Captain Logan, are not remembered as firm guardians of discipline, but condemned to infernal torment. Convicts, by contrast, receive a welcome denied to them in life. The reversal is not merely comic consolation, though it is certainly that. It is a radical rearrangement of moral authority. Rank, office, uniform, and title are stripped of their earthly magic. In hell, a commandant cannot hide behind regulations. A flogger cannot plead procedure. The colonial hierarchy arrives without its paperwork and finds awkwardly that paperwork was doing a lot of the ethical heavy lifting. That gesture matters within the broader logic of penal discipline. The colonial system depended on making punishment appear inevitable and deserved. Its violence had to be narrated as correction. Its victims had to be narratable as degraded men whose degradation explained itself. MacNamara's poem breaks that loop. By depicting administrators as morally answerable, he refuses the assumption that power proves virtue. By granting convicts dignity in the afterlife, he refuses the assumption that punishment defines worth. He does not deny that convicts have been condemned. He asks who, in the end, is fit to condemn. The choice of hell also gives the poem a pleasingly nasty symmetry. Penal colonies often presented themselves as moral laboratories, places where corruption could be burned out through labour, pain, surveillance, and enforced obedience. MacNamara turns the theology back on its authors. If suffering purifies, then perhaps the men who designed so much of it deserve a proper course. If discipline reveals character, then the disciplinarians may enjoy having theirs revealed under warmer conditions. The joke is theological, political, and deeply colonial. The empire built a hell on earth, and MacNamara had the poor manners to map where its architects should stand in the next one. The poem's imaginative force lies in its refusal to let official language have the final word. Colonial records could list offences, punishments, absences, floggings, and refusals, but they could not contain the moral surplus of convict experience. They could say that a man was punished. They could not easily say what that punishment meant to those forced to live inside it. A convict's tour to hell supplies that missing meaning. It converts pain into testimony and mockery into verdict. It does not ask the colony to reform itself, which would have required a touching faith in institutions doing anything other than protecting themselves. Instead, it imagines a jurisdiction beyond their reach. In doing so, MacNamara transforms poetic fantasy into political counter-record. The colonial state wrote him down as a convict, a worker, a body to be corrected. He wrote back as a witness. His hell is not only a place of punishment, it is the archive the empire failed to control. Their moral reality survives administrative distortion. There the brutal are named, there the degraded speak. And there, with a neatness the colonial courts never managed, justice finally acquires a memory.
Who is that, sir, in yonder blaze? Who on fire and brimstone seems to graze? 'Tis Captain Logan of Moreton Bay, and Williams, who was killed the other day. He was overseer at Grace Farm, and done poor prisoners no little harm. Cook, who discovered New South Wales, and he that first invented jails, are both tied to a fiery stake which stands in yonder boiling lake. Hark! Do you hear this dreadful yelling? It issues from Dr. Wardell's dwelling.
Penal discipline did not merely punish bodies. Any half-competent tyranny can do that before breakfast. Its more ambitious project was social. To keep convicts atomized, each man locked inside his own degradation, persuaded that misery was not a shared condition but a private failure. The lash marked the body, but isolation did the quieter work. It taught the prisoner that his suffering belonged to him alone. That was the point. A convict who thinks collectively is already halfway to being troublesome. A convict who thinks politically is a full administrative nuisance. MacNamara's poetry made that nuisance portable. The colonial state understood paper. It adored paper. Warrants, conduct records, punishment books, assignment orders, petitions, tickets of leave. The empire had a touching faith in the moral authority of stationery. Written words could classify a man, condemn him, move him, flog him, or make him vanish into a work gang. But paper also had a weakness. It could be seized. It could be filed. It could be buried in some office until it became useful to nobody except future historians, those patient scavengers of bureaucratic compost. Orality was harder to manage. A remembered poem did not sit politely in a drawer. A rhyme could move from one convict to another without permission. It could travel down a road gang, across a campfire, through a barracks, into a hut, onto a chain gang, and back again, gathering alterations and loyalties as it went. The authorities might confiscate a manuscript, but confiscating memory was trickier. Even empire, with its usual confidence, had limits. MacNamara's verse worked in precisely this awkward space. It was not simply self-expression, though it was certainly that. It became a shared script of defiance, a way for convicts to recognize one another inside a system designed to reduce them to obedient fragments. His poems gave language to injuries that official records preferred to describe as discipline, correction, or moral improvement. Those fine old euphemisms by which respectable violence tidies itself up before tea. In MacNamara's hands, complaint became communal performance. A grievance was no longer merely endured. It was recited, remembered, laughed over, sharpened, and passed on. That communal element is crucial. Penal regimes thrive when pain remains mute and individual. MacNamara's poetry turned pain outward. It made suffering legible as a social fact rather than a personal defect. This was not revolution in the grand European sense, with flags, barricades, manifestos, and young men getting themselves killed for abstractions. It was rougher, smaller, and probably more useful. A convict hearing MacNamara's lines was invited to understand his own condition as part of a larger pattern. The overseer's cruelty, the magistrate's contempt, the absurdity of forced labour, the hypocrisy of colonial virtue. These were not isolated misfortunes. They were systemic. One hesitates to use the word, since it now has the air of a seminar room with bad coffee, but in this case it fits. The 1843 Port Arthur go-slow protest shows how far this oral authority could extend beyond mockery. Port Arthur was not designed as a venue for industrial negotiation, to put it mildly. It was a machine for breaking men who had already been judged resistant to more ordinary forms of coercion. Yet MacNamara reportedly helped lead a collective slowing of labour against a punitive work regime. This was resistance with a convict accent, disciplined enough to be effective, deniable enough to survive, and insolent enough to irritate the people who deserved it. The go-slow matters not because it transformed the penal colony overnight. It did not. The British did not suddenly fling down their ledgers, apologise for transportation, and embrace restorative justice in a moving display of imperial self-awareness. Rather, the protest reveals the social authority MacNamara had acquired among men whom the system wanted leaderless. His power did not come from office, property, education in the polite sense, or official legitimacy. It came from voice, more exactly, from a voice others had made their own. His poetry functioned as an underground legislative voice. That phrase is not as grand as it first sounds. Legislation names a world, it declares what counts, who belongs, what behaviour is shameful, what conduct deserves honour. The penal state legislated through punishment and paperwork. MacNamara legislated through rhyme, ridicule, and memory. He offered a competing moral code in which solidarity mattered more than obedience, endurance more than respectability, and wit more than submission. For men officially defined as degraded, this was no small thing. It allowed them to imagine themselves not merely as punished bodies, but as members of a moral community. That community was not sentimental. It was not all mateship and noble suffering, the sort of thing later nationalism would launder into legend with suspicious enthusiasm. Convict society could be brutal, divided, desperate, and predatory. No need to paint the chain gang as a bush picnic with better songs. But MacNamara's verse created moments of common recognition within that world. It gave convicts a language in which the powerful could be mocked and the punished could answer back. In a regime built on enforced silence, that was a serious breach of design. The weaponization of orality also explains why MacNamara exceeded the limits of his own biography. Had his work remained only in manuscript, it might have disappeared into the usual colonial swamp of loss, neglect, and official indifference. Instead, it lived in mouths before it lived in print. That survival was not accidental. Oral circulation suited the social conditions of convict life. Mobile, precarious, surveilled, and suspicious of authority with excellent reason. His poems were durable because they were useful. They entertained, certainly, but they also named injustice, mocked terror, and made endurance communal. The penal system wanted each convict to feel alone under the Crown's magnificent boot. MacNamara's achievement was to make that boot audible. Once heard collectively, it became something else. Not fate, not personal disgrace, but power doing what power does when nobody has yet laughed at it properly. His poetry did not abolish the system. Poetry rarely does, despite what poets and arts funding bodies may suggest, but it loosened the system's grip on meaning. It taught convicts to hear their own suffering in chorus. And once a punishment regime loses control of the story being told about it, the flogging can continue, but the authority has already started to rot.
Peter, says Jesus, let Frank in, for he is thoroughly purged from sin, and although in convict's habit dressed here, he shall be a welcome guest.
MacNamara's life did not end with the tidy moral symmetry that colonial punishment liked to imagine for itself. There was no redemption staged for public instruction, no grateful old convict blessing the civilizing lash, no final proof that discipline had produced obedience. He died in 1861 in poverty of hypothermia and inanition, which is a clinically polite way of saying that cold and hunger finished what the empire had begun. The system had extracted his labour, marked his body, wasted his health, and then, with the administrative elegance for which empires are rightly notorious, left him to disappear. On paper, that should have been the end of him. The state had the ledgers, the court records, the conduct reports, the punishments, the labels. Incorrigible was the kind of word colonial authority adored, brisk, final, and wonderfully absolving. It turned a man into a category and a category into a sentence. Once a convict had been described that way, every act of resistance could be made to look like proof of the diagnosis. Refuse labour, incorrigible. Write a satire, insolent. Abscond, naturally depraved. Survive 14 floggings without becoming morally improved. A difficult customer plainly. This was the bureaucratic genius of the penal colony. It did not merely punish bodies. It wrote explanations for why those bodies deserved punishment. MacNamara's official life, as preserved by the state, was therefore meant to be a cautionary scrap. Thief, absconder, agitator, repeat offender, nuisance. A man filed under failure, yet the file did not hold him. His poems slipped the institutional net because they had never depended wholly on institutional permission. They moved by mouth, memory, performance, repetition. They survived in the informal circuits of convict and working-class culture, where a verse did not need a publisher to matter and a rhyme could travel further than a magistrate's patience. The irony is not subtle, though history rarely is when it is feeling pleased with itself. The official archive reduced MacNamara to criminality, while the unofficial archive preserved him as a voice. His poems survived through oral tradition before later publication in the late 19th century brought them into a more recognizable literary record. By then, the colonial world that had tried to silence him had begun the awkward process of turning its own brutal origins into folklore. Transportation, once an embarrassment to polite society, became raw material for national character. The chain gang, the flogging triangle, the bush road, the bolter, the insolent prisoner, all were gradually repackaged into the founding scenery of Australian toughness, scepticism, and anti-authoritarian charm. We do enjoy polishing shackles into heirlooms. MacNamara's afterlife sits squarely inside that transformation. His verse helped shape the rebellious idiom later attached to figures like Ned Kelly, whose own mythology depends on much the same moral grammar: the poor man against the uniform, the outlaw as witness, the law as something rather less than justice. This is not to say MacNamara somehow invented Australian defiance by himself. Nations are never that efficient, but his work gave early poetic form to a stance that would become culturally durable. Suspicion of authority, sympathy for the punished, respect for verbal cheek, and a stubborn belief that rank and virtue are not the same thing, however many medals a governor pins to himself. The movement from chain gang verse to schoolroom mythology is therefore more than a charming literary afterthought. It marks a profound reversal in cultural authority. The penal regime sought to define MacNamara as waste, wasted labour, wasted discipline, wasted moral effort. Later Australian memory, selective and self-flattering as national memory tends to be, found in him something closer to origin. The man once treated as a problem to be managed became part of the emotional vocabulary through which Australians learned to imagine themselves. Egalitarian, irreverent, allergic to pomp, fond of the underdog, provided the underdog is safely historical and no longer asking for rent relief. There is a danger, of course, in making MacNamara too comfortable as heritage. National cultures have a nasty habit of domesticating their rebels after death. A convict poet who mocked power can be turned into a quaint emblem of larrikin spirit. Suffering becomes colour, brutality becomes atmosphere, resistance becomes personality. The lash fades, the yarn remains. That sentimental conversion should be resisted. MacNamara's significance lies not in offering a cheerful prehistory of Australian mateship, but in exposing the violence beneath it. His defiance was not a lifestyle preference. It was produced under coercion, hunger, flogging, forced labour, surveillance, and official contempt. If his voice later became useful to national mythology, it did so because it had first been forged against the machinery of degradation. Still, the survival of that voice is the final embarrassment for the Penal project. The Crown could flog MacNamara, transport him, classify him, confine him, and reduce him materially to poverty. It could not make his words behave. The state's records remain naturally. Bureaucracies are hard to kill and rarely know when they are dead. But beside them stands another record. Comic, bitter, communal, unruly, remembered. In that record, MacNamara is not merely an object of punishment, he is a witness against it. The final irony is sharp enough. The penal system wanted mute labour and produced a poet. It wanted submission and preserved defiance. It wanted to brand MacNamara as an incorrigible felon, yet his words outlived the moral authority of his jailers and entered the imaginative life of the nation that replaced them. The body was punished. The voice escaped. For an empire so fond of paperwork, that is a fairly serious administrative failure.
Thro' heaven's concave their rejoicings rang, and hymns of praise to God they sang. And as they praised his glorious name, I awoke and found 'twas but a dream.